Hey, Lindsay, how's it going?
Good, thanks. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. So today we're obviously discussing the final component of the dark triad being
hmm
Machiavellianism, which
hmm
really flies quite under the radar. It's not often discussed. There's not a lot of literature about it, not a lot of
Not
research.
compared to narcissism and psychopathy, certainly.
No,
Yeah.
it's like just this little stealth thing that cruises along. So if we had to sort of frame what Machiavellianism actually is, what are some of the core features, would you say?
And I think sometimes it's helpful to contrast it
Mm,
to the other elements that we've looked at in the dark triad. So where narcissism might be quite loud and quite noticeable, and psychopathy might be more reckless or impulsive. This is a really patient, playing the long game, very strategic,
mm,
calculating kind of a position to come from.
yeah, and it's quite focused on strategic manipulation, but quite a lot of emotional detachment. And the morality is quite flexible for people that have Machiavellian type traits. They're kind of not impulsive, they're not emotional, not loud, but their morals are very much focused on achieving their outcome.
Yeah, so I would say if an outcome conflicted with a moral position, it would perhaps go in favor of the outcome. So it
Yeah.
is there. So it's not a lack of moralistic awareness or a sense of that, but it's very much about when it's aligned with or not aligned with outcomes and goals that the person has themselves.
Yeah. And it's an
Mm.
interesting one because it's the patience is really interesting.
Mm.
Some of the texts that I've read about Machiavellianism is it's almost like they're playing a really long game
Yeah.
and they don't mind looking humiliated along the journey or whatever, as long as they can achieve that outcome. They're
Mhm.
just very, very focused, quite strategic.
And with that in mind, can tolerate a great deal of things that perhaps the other two positions or presentations we were looking at wouldn't tolerate. So can manage very difficult experiences, humiliation, not worried about looking good or how they're seen in others' eyes,
Mm,
and really able to tolerate that sort of delayed gratification.
yeah,
So can really sit and be very patient if something is working towards the ultimate long-term goal.
yeah.
So where narcissism might really struggle with, how they're feeling perceived or judged in the eyes of others, the Machiavellian person or someone who's high on the Machiavellian score would be able to tolerate that as long as it aligned or was in the service of a goal that they were wanting to work towards.
Yeah. Now, where it comes from is interesting.
Mm,
So Nikolai Machiavelli. So what's the
mm,
story there? Like, why does it come from
mm.
there?
So he was a diplomat, a Florentine diplomat, 16th century. So we're going way, way back. And he published a book. His most famous work was called The Prince, but it really rocked opponents and people thought it was really quite shocking. And the term Machiavellian behaviour or Machiavellianism didn't really exist during his lifetime. It was afterwards. So it was then when people used his name to become a descriptor, almost becoming an insult for people that it was characterized as displaying very sort of cold, very calculated, very cruel ways of behaving. Looking back, I think others would argue that's not actually what Machiavelli was saying in his works, or he was, but it became an insult. And then it became embedded in language. And then later on, the language hardened into a concept. And then the concept became solidified in the scientific literature. So where we've arrived now, with what we mean and what we've come to understand by the term, someone is a Machiavellian person or Machiavellian behavior, is perhaps quite far out. Machiavelli himself would probably be turning in his grave if he appreciated quite the legacy that his name has come to have.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it might never have been part of the dark triad had he not contributed that piece of work. So it is an interesting one. And
Mm.
If you're a person that is on the receiving end of this, let's
Mm.
look at some of the signs to sort of spot a Machiavellian, without too much pathologizing. But it's like, my understanding is you rarely see it, you feel it.
Mhm.
It's almost
Yeah.
after the event when you do a post-mortem, you think, how did I get here? How did I
Mhm.
agree to that? What on earth happened? How did I
Yeah.
give away all my money or end up in this position that I'm in? And people can kind of feel quite strategically managed as a
Yeah.
fallout of being around a Machiavellian. But what are some of the other signs that people can see?
Well, I think, as you said, it's almost the absence of what's there. So it's not loud, it's not explosive, it's not really present and really something that we would hook into. It's almost perhaps where we feel afterwards we've been maneuvered into something that we think, how did I arrive here? How did I get, put in this situation? And almost, yeah, maneuvered. I like the word maneuvered that you used. It almost feels like the skill set around someone who can manage situations, quite calculating, very strategic, thinking, 3 moves ahead, not needing to address their own emotional needs in the same way, but can remain really crystal and laser focused on the goal. So often, where other people may have other things that kind of interrupt and impact on their interactions, the person who is interacting with someone who's high on the Machiavellian sort of scale would perhaps experience them as a bit cold, but there isn't a lack of emotions. There's definitely cognitive empathy intact, but perhaps emotions are used more like information. So
Mm.
it's more like pieces on a chessboard being moved around rather than, needing to respond to emotions in the way that other people might.
Yeah, and it's not as overt in the gaslighting as it is with narcissism, because that gaslighting can be really, how could you say that?
Hmm.
This is very much, if you're on the receiving end of it, you just, oh, that was never my intention. You're reading into it. Let's be a bit more logical here.
Hmm.
So there's no rage and there's no chaos. It's just repositioning entirely what has happened in,
Hmm.
oh, I have no idea why you feeling like that. That's not my
Mm.
intention. And so you, on the receiving end, feel slightly off balance. You
Mm.
kind of a little bit less certain of your own instincts, a little bit like off kilter, or maybe I misread the whole situation. Like you are the emotional one and the unreasonable one. So
Yeah.
impact from a gaslighting perspective is way more brutal, because it's that off kilter feeling that the person has, which is truly making them doubt their sense of reality and what
Mm.
they've just come up with.
It's more insidious. I think it doesn't
Mm.
have that obviousness of it happening in the moment. So I think it can creep in, almost gets in under the radar. And I think it can happen more so without us realizing it. And you use the phrase around there not being the chaos. I think that the calmness often almost mismatches what you might, the sort of the incongruence you're starting to feel in yourself doesn't match with what is seemingly quite a calm interaction. And actually, I would say often people, or Machiavellianism would be considered, calm, certainly, but almost like if psychopathy is kind of reckless and impulsive, kind of foot on the accelerator, this is almost like risk averse, actually
Mm.
checking the mirrors, just being really guarded, very aware of their positioning in the situation at all
Yeah.
times.
Which is why in that insidiousness, people only notice it almost after the event,
Hmm.
in a
Hmm.
post-mortem or an analysis of what
Mm.
happened. It's much harder to see at the time.
And I think it's harder for it to be noticed sort of more broadly. So where perhaps in organizations, people perhaps more on the psychopathic side of things or narcissistic, it is much more obvious and damaging to their trajectory in their job role. Whereas actually this would be a much slower burn. So
Mm.
it's only maybe if someone's ended up in a situation where the individual who's Machiavellian their goals didn't align with others. It's only really at that point of everything coming to fruition that you would even really have a sense of, oh, this person isn't playing by the same rules that I'm playing by, or this is not aligned. So it often wouldn't get picked up on, wouldn't be noticed. So it's the subtlety that I think that can be tricky. But I also think it's important to note it is situational.
Mm.
So the literature says that it's normally distributed, which means like many of the personality traits. So this isn't a disorder; it's kind of a trait. It exists in sort of where there's quite a lot of people that have a bit of it in the middle. Not very many have high levels of Machiavellianism or high scores, and not many are really low. But what we find is that environments can elicit more tendencies towards Machiavellian behaviour. So I think we all have it within us in certain contexts, but environments where maybe the rules are ambiguous, or there are really big differences between those who have power and those who don't have power, and people where you have to really be quite a political thinker in terms of kind of succeeding or surviving in an environment, is more likely to bring it out. Equally, and perhaps where there's high levels of trust, that level of it carves more opportunities for someone to assert and have their own needs met, or their goals, work towards their goals. So in environments where there's a lower distance between who has power and who doesn't, where there is more clarity around rules, even someone who might otherwise score a bit higher on a Machiavellian scale wouldn't demonstrate as much of that behaviour. So it's in us, and it's situationally contingent
Mm.
upon the environment as well.
So if you scanned a brain, you wouldn't see it as obviously, because it being a trait. It's part
Mm.
learning, part temperament, and then part adaptation to that
Mm-hmm.
environment. Indeed.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm.
If you are a Machiavellian person, I'm always interested
Mm.
in what it's like to see the world like that. I mean, what I have kind of understood from the literature is that the world feels quite competitive. There's this sense
Mm.
of you win, I somehow lose. So I can't really trust you and I can't really be vulnerable. I must keep my cards very close to my chest. And their nervous system seems very organized around control,
Mhm.
anticipation, and strategic maneuvering. But what are you kind of thinking and feeling? I mean, I don't think they think they're manipulative. I think they just think they're maneuvering things.
I mean, I guess to some extent, it depends how far along the sort of spectrum we would be looking. Um, but I think that, yes, people would feel things. They do have emotions. They can understand what other people's emotions are. But I think that maybe not feeling the push and pull of
Mm,
emotions, or the need to react to other people's emotions. Maybe a certain ability to be quite resilient, quite robust, quite goal oriented in a very long term way. So I think that it, it, there, I would imagine, so this is me perhaps trying to imagine what this would be like. If you operate in the world, you walk through the world as someone who's very goal oriented, and, if we're aligned, then great. If we're not, I'll do what I need to do to ensure that my goals are protected. I think that really damages your sense of being able to trust anyone, because I think we often naturally assume that other people view the world the same way as us, which is why people who are very trusting often are quick to trust others, because they assume other people are trustworthy because I'm trustworthy. So yeah, I think that there is a certain cynicism um,
mm,
that can be born out of how you see the world reflected back at you in what you think other people would be like.
mm. But it's interesting. I think if I was a Machiavellian character, be very
Hmm.
calm on the surface. I'd be
Hmm.
displaying very few emotions, but I'm almost hyper vigilant at the same time, but never giving off that I'm hyper vigilant, because I'm constantly scanning for leverage. I'm scanning for threat, and then I'm scanning for that advantage that I need to actually get what I
Hmm.
want.
I think that's so true, because information is the real currency here. So you're constantly looking, trying to read a room, stay several moves ahead, read for how things are landing. So I think that sort of internal alert is always switched on. The radar is always scanning, which takes its toll on the nervous system, for sure.
Yeah.
Mm.
for sure. And then I think it would be interesting to kind of just think a little bit about the kind of environments that would bring this out. We're talking about that kind of power differential.
Hmm.
Thinking of politics, thinking of,
Hmm.
corporate world, but the high end side of the corporate world. What other
Hmm.
kinds of environments where would we see these kinds of traits emerging?
I would imagine environments where things are really competitive and a
Mm,
kind of almost a dog eat dog kind of environment where not everyone can win together. So it's thinking about, more if you win, I lose type
mm.
environments, then it becomes more important to make sure that you are looking out for yourself, looking out for your goals and maneuvering things to achieve that. Um,
Yeah, like the legal profession, I suppose.
Yeah, yeah. Any high stakes.
Yeah,
I think certainly where there were a lot of corporate environments, political environments, and I think that's borne out about some of the characters how we might have seen some of the Machiavellian characters portrayed on
yeah,
television and media.
yeah,
And I think it mostly is those kind of high stakes um, shows that have a
yeah.
more political or corporate feel to them.
Definitely. And I think, just thinking of a Machiavellian sort of the traits and how they develop it, because it's part situational and environmental, and you learn these techniques. And that early environment would have been where care was quite inconsistent. Maybe the power
Mhm.
balance was very uneven. But then where perhaps honesty was punished, or and you develop the kind of quite avoidant, dismissive attachment pattern as a
Mhm.
result of that. But then the child would have learnt, okay, feelings don't keep me safe. My thinking and my strategy and being calm in the moment does. So it's that kind of, if you think of, just some of those traits and how they've developed, it's not like we
Mm.
scan a brain and you can see it. You
No,
feel
and it's
it.
definitely that both and. I think, not every person would be no even if they had the same environment that you just described, not every person would be able to have the calmness, to be able to regulate, to do or to develop those more sort of Machiavellian tendencies. Equally, I think that you would have to have experiences that would indicate you need to look out for yourself. You
Yeah.
need to chase down your goals. If you want to have it happen, you've got to make it happen. So I think those early life experiences, as with so many things, would be informing the what develops and what doesn't. It certainly isn't a case of a person turns 18 and whoop, a flick,
Yeah. Yeah.
switch
There you
flicks
go.
on
Just
and
become.
now,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah.
So some of the kind of the myths and the facts, so myth number one would be they're obviously manipulators. And I think the thing is it's a little bit more subtle than straight manipulation, because you'd only really see it after the fact. So they don't push. There isn't this pushiness where you're like, I'm being
Mm-mm.
manipulated. It's they've positioned things. You see it
Mm.
afterwards, and you years later, you're like, hang on a second. How did I agree to that? How did I get there? Like, I was steered. It's
Yeah.
that feeling of being steered. The next myth would be that, well, they're obviously very emotionally unintelligent. And research actually shows there's a very
Yeah.
high level of cognitive empathy, but they understand emotions very deeply. They just never feel responsible for the impact of them. And they can even, in the moment, you can even feel, oh, I didn't intend that. Oh, I'm sorry that you feel like that. Where you feel, oh, they genuinely feel this. But
Mhm.
later you kind of think, well, hang on a second. So when there's that hang on a second feeling, I think that's kind of a sign as well.
Yeah.
What about the idea that they're basically narcissists? I mean, if we think, nah, I would say
No,
that's a myth.
that's a real myth. I would say that the ability of a person, sort of higher on the Machiavellian end, the ability they have to forego their ego,
Mm,
to not look good in the eyes of others, to not need praise, to not need recognition, to tolerate some quite tricky stuff as long as it's in the service of their long-term goals
Mm.
is not something that someone that was high on sort of the
No,
narcissistic end would be
because
able to do.
they win very quietly. It's very
Mm,
much that, and they don't need that admiration, so their ego
mm-mm,
can be sacrificed. They need their goal.
mm-mm.
Mm, it's interesting. And
And often you
on,
might think of it with narcissism, the goal is about receiving or having interactions that
mm,
reinforce that fragile sense of self. Whereas for a Machiavellian person, it would be that that's not the goal. The goal
mm,
is whatever is the longer term
the long
outcome that
game.
they're aiming for. Yeah.
Yeah. Are they always successful though? I think that's are they clever enough to always get what they want? Like that's the tricky
I mean,
part.
that's a hard one to myth bust for sure, one way or the other. And I think a pragmatic answer has to be absolutely not possible that they're always successful. But I think that they're able to do a lot of things that other people wouldn't be willing to do with goal orientation. So
Yeah.
I think it depends how you measure success and if the determinants of success are aligned with their goals. So if we're talking about climbing a corporate ladder, if the goals to do that, they will be able to perform, they will be able to engage at least even sort of with others as a function of getting on and moving up. So I think certainly they have a lot of qualities to be able to succeed. And it's all about, I think, the alignment of their goals with, do those behaviors make sense for their goals? If there was a shift and suddenly their goals were no longer aligned with the behaviors that were necessary to be considered successful, then they would opt most likely for their long-term goal, and then they would be deemed not successful. So yeah, it kind
Mm.
of depends on how we're defining it.
I kind of think of Machiavellianism a little bit like a chess game, like where you are the
Hmm.
grand master of the tournament and you're
Hmm.
quite willing to sacrifice some pieces in the short term to win the game overall, because your goal in that moment of sacrificing the pieces is to see if you can find the tell of your opponent. And it's
Hmm.
this kind of game of, can I find the tell of the opponent to ultimately win my long-term game? That's kind of the strategy there. And then I think
I think
just,
chess is a really nice analogy for it. If you've ever watched anyone who's a grandmaster, so good at chess,
mm,
and you see them and you think, how did they know? How could they predict, 5 moves ahead that this was what was going to win them the game? I think it can feel or can look a bit similar to that. That's like how did they know that doing this here today would be the thing that would reveal itself later to have been instrumental in achieving their outcome down the line.
yeah,
So very strategic. Yeah.
yeah. So just in kind of summary, we have a person that actually has quite a chronic stress physiology, but you can't see
Hmm.
it. They stay
Hmm.
super calm, so they have elevated cortisol levels, but they're that constant vigilance and scanning for opportunities and leverage and advantage and that kind of thing. They're actually not calm at all. They
Next level masking skills.
total
Yeah.
next level masking. This next is avoidant attachment. So they're truly avoidant and dismissive, but you don't always feel dismissed until much later when you feel steered. They're very good at delayed gratification. They don't
Hmm.
have this huge ego and they don't mind foregoing that for the long-term outcome. And then they see relationships as transactional. They kind of not love is measured in kind of utility rather than mutuality. Mm,
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, what would be, just some of the kind of television characters? We had to think of TV characters and TV shows and
Mm.
things out there. I mean, I'm thinking of Game of Thrones,
Hmm.
Peter Baelish, that Littlefinger character. Ooh,
Uh-huh.
he was
A real
so
maneuverer behind the scenes, but
mm,
really, yeah, and several steps ahead all the time.
all the
Yeah.
time. Yeah. And you kind of only see later because he seemed like quite a weak character to begin with. And then and he humiliated and all this stuff. But his long game that was revealed later was pretty insidious.
the genius that sat behind some of the decisions and the actions only revealed itself once
Like
the long term was revealed. Yeah.
exactly. And then, and they almost people only realize the impact when it was too late or much later.
Mhm.
And I think that's really a key sign that you're
Mm.
in the presence of one. Then there's that other character from Succession, Tom Wamsgans, who,
Which I haven't watched.
oh no, he was good. He was really good. He would just kind of, he was playing a very, very long game
Mhm.
in the show. And he didn't look confident. He looked really weak or anxious, like he had high anxiety and would kind of mask really well. And he endured a lot of humiliation. But then to come out in the way that it all played out was pretty clever. Again, you watch the show and everybody at the end is shaking their heads, going, "Hang on a second." Yeah, that's definitely a sign. And then, of course, my favorite example, which is a bit more theatrical, would be
Mm.
House of Cards, Frank Underwood. Goodness, like very, very, um, yeah, very Machiavellian, very long game, very calm on the
Mm.
surface, but always scanning.
I didn't have any others than the ones you talked about, but I think it speaks to the idea that so when we, I guess, looking for those characters, those are the people that are perhaps really stereotyped of the extreme end of that spectrum. And I think what's interesting with this is that we all have a little bit of Machiavellian potential within us,
Mm,
and that it can be brought out to a greater or lesser degree. But I think looking for those TV characters really helps just pop it in your, you just have that recognition of like, oh yeah, yeah, I
yeah,
know it now.
yeah. And just some of the signs, like if you are kind of in a position where you're wondering, well, hang on a second, have I been around kind of Machiavellian type character? I think one of the key ones is you feel managed, you feel
Mhm.
steered, not emotionally met, but kind of, I feel like I've been guided here in some way, positioned. What are some of
Mhm.
the other signs that make you feel like, hang on, have I been in the presence of one?
I think that calmness, so
Mm,
thinking how a person might be responding to a situation where you would normally expect more of a reaction, but if they're able to, and this is not in isolation, so being able to stay calm amid, emotionally heated um, conversations. But if there's an ability to really stay focused on outcomes or moving towards something,
mm,
just feeling like perhaps they're not in the emotion with you, so they can see it, they might be responding with things that logically make sense, but perhaps it's just not connecting in some way. That might be someone who's able to hold more of that detachment from the emotional material, doesn't feel compelled to respond to your emotions, but perhaps continues with that. I think you use the word steering, that maneuvering. So feeling as though that there's always an end game, but
yes.
you don't quite know what it is.
And perhaps another one would be that information feels very selective when it comes to them. They're very good at
Mhm.
getting information out of you, but information
Mm.
from them, they omit or they delay or
Mhm.
stall, or all under a mask of perhaps this feels anxious, or perhaps
Mm.
they seem almost innocent in a way,
Mm.
but actually you end the situation going, well, hang on, I didn't get clarity. I don't have clarity. What happened
Mhm.
there? There's that kind of sense that you were managed.
And a real one-way street in terms of
Yes.
information flow. So someone who might be really skillful at eliciting information. I don't mean kind of, corporate secrets or state secrets. I mean kind of just getting more from you than they give in return.
I think another one that I was thinking of was accountability doesn't ever feel like it's fully landed over there. They'll deflect slightly, but with some emotion, like that was never my intention, or perhaps you've misread the situation. Let's just be rational and logical. So it makes you feel like your perception and your behavior is erratic or too emotional, and you doubt yourself, which is
Mhm.
in my
Mm.
in my kind of definition is way more subtle gaslighting than perhaps on the receiving end of a narcissist.
It would absolutely be less chaotic, much more nuanced, much more polished. And I guess I would also be thinking the response to a person would depend where that person sits in relation to them achieving their goal. So if a relationship with that person was instrumental in achieving a goal or an outcome or something that's important to them, then that might be engaged with in a different way. But that's still, again, because it's aligned with I guess,
Mm,
where the person would like things to move to. So it's not necessarily because there's that situational component. None of these things are hard and fast that it would always feel that way. I think it's very much then where you fit into the picture. Where are you on their chessboard?
yes.
And then thinking about that perhaps would generate different responses
Yeah.
based on that.
I think another sign would be that they're super calm, but
Mhm.
perhaps you're a little bit more on the dysregulated sign. There's no drama, there's no rage that you kind of see in
Mhm.
narcissistic dynamics. It's a
Mhm.
little bit more just slightly off balance, just slightly over explaining,
Mhm.
slightly dysregulated, confusing, not
Mm.
clear.
Just that people almost feel you feel like you've been in the presence of someone who's had a rule book to how to be an operator, how to operate with power, how to maneuver things around in a way that you think, I don't feel like I have this same textbook. You
Yeah.
seem to be able to do things or to see things in a way that is just not as visible to others.
Yeah.
As I say, yeah, that there is something inherent within us that would determine the personality trait, but also the environmental factors that would
Yeah.
really shape the extent to which this is a much more fleshed out trait in us
Yeah.
as a person.
I think other signs would be that the relationships or relationship with that person feels very transactional. Will
Mhm.
feel like I owe this person or they have leverage and it's about compliance. So if you're feeling, oh,
Yeah.
I need to comply or I owe them, and it feels like I need to do X because they gave me Y. So they're really good at understanding the law of reciprocity. And kind of if I
Mhm.
give something up front or concede some chess pieces up front, you now kind of they have leverage and like you owe me. So in the the art of war, they've really
Mhm.
mastered these dynamics very, very well.
Yeah, and it would be that art of pulling things from others,
Rather
and that
than
then that might
pushing. Yeah. Yeah.
rather than pushing or compelling rather than a forceful way, and that dynamic might shift quite suddenly if you no longer serve or support the person meeting their goals. So that might be then where it might feel one way for a period of time, but then suddenly something shifts in the landscape, and you might just be dropped. You're no longer part of the picture in the same way.
And I think another sign would be that you notice later that they've never been truly vulnerable. Whatever they disclose seems hollow or empty. There's facts,
Mhm.
but you don't know their fears. You don't know what they're thinking.
Mhm.
It feels like the whole thing was very strategic. And
Mhm.
a sign would be you just watch their trajectory. You're like, oh wow, look what they
Mhm.
achieved. I can see they did
Mhm.
this and then this and this.
Mm.
How did that happen? So you almost see it
And I think
after the fact.
yeah, sharing just enough that superficially we might start to feel as though we're in a meaningful interaction. So
Mm,
then we might start to open up. But perhaps, like you say, it's always that after the fact, look back and think, hang on a minute. When I
mm,
actually look at it, that wasn't a sort of reciprocal interaction. I might have shared a lot more vulnerability, but actually they didn't when I look back
mm.
on it.
So as we've obviously said with the dark triad, it's not neat and tidy. We're not
Mhm.
100% of anything. You can have kind of traits or presentation across all three.
Mhm.
But I think if you've been on the receiving end of the dark triad and you feeling your own reality is completely, in a mess, you feel less than, smaller, there's that sense of I've lost myself somehow. It's really important to take the time and process that, write the
Mhm.
whole thing out. How did this happen? What happened there? And
Mm.
I think the key is when I work with people who've been on the receiving end of anything to do with the dark triad is they've just blamed themselves so much, and
Mhm.
that it's really important, I think, from a compassion focused perspective to get that this often finding yourself in this situation is not your fault. But there's a lot that you can do to regulate yourself to get back into empowerment. And I
Mhm.
think by educating and understanding a little bit more of these dynamics, you might spot them a little bit sooner. But we don't get pulled aside in high school and taught this is the dark triad and this is how to spot it. It just,
No.
yeah.
And often putting ourselves out there in the world is
Mm,
about taking interpersonal risks. So, the only way to really avoid that is to wrap ourselves up in cotton wool and not open up, not connect, because actually we don't get to know a person and whether or not this might be part of their picture until we're already several steps in. So I think there's something about really sitting with that. It's not your fault if you've been in a relationship that has impacted you or hurt you or
mm,
damaged you. And at the same time, it is your responsibility to think, well, what can I do to heal, to help myself, to support myself, to forgive my part, whatever that may be or not, in how things evolved. And I think it's that distinction between fault and responsibility that's really empowering. I think it's about thinking about where can we take control back for ourselves and our lives and then moving on.
yeah. And kind of really feeling back into your own instincts as well. If you
Mm.
feel something feels a bit off, just pause. I think taking that pause and giving yourself an opportunity to just assess, why do I feel off balance? I'm not comfortable right now. I feel a little bit maneuvered, or I feel a little bit like my reality was just challenged there. Trust that, to kind of
Yeah.
trust that sense, because it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you. And just because somebody says, no, you're overreacting, or you're emotional, or you're this, or you're that,
Mhm.
doesn't make what they're saying true. I think not taking them so much at face value is really like sitting with, how does this make me feel as a person? And if
Mm.
I feel uncomfortable, just pull back, chill,
And
pause.
there's nothing to lose from taking a pause.
Mm,
So actually the pause, you might pause and think, oh, okay, no, actually, when I look at how I'm responding, maybe actually they're noticing something in me and let me take a look at myself. Or it might be, no, actually, this isn't sitting right. This isn't feeling okay. We lose nothing by taking a pause, tuning in,
mm.
checking out where we're at, what's going on, what's our nervous system telling us, how do we settle that, regulate ourselves. There's that can only be helpful to
Yeah,
be more
for
connected
sure.
to ourselves.
Great. Well, that concludes our sort of 3 episodes on the dark
Mm,
triad,
mm.
and looking at the kind of dark side of personality traits and presentations. But in our next episode, we're going to look at the exact opposite, which is
Yeah,
being
we're going.
super positive, and like epic, and everything's wonderful. We're going to be looking at toxic positivity next.
We are.
Yeah, indeed. All right. So thanks for staying tuned on all things health, relationships, and trauma. And we'll see you next time. Take care. The information shared on the Naked Insights podcast is for educational and information purposes only, and is not intended as a substitute for professional therapy or counseling. While we aim to provide helpful and accurate insights, individual experiences may vary. If you're experiencing trauma, mental health issues, or distress, please seek guidance from a qualified professional. The views expressed by us as the hosts are our own and do not necessarily reflect the opinions or positions of any affiliated organizations.